Good evening to everyone. My name is Jim Haggerty of PRCG Haggerty, strategic communications firm. And I want to welcome you all here for this reception on the subject of modeling Irish unification, which presents the first ever comprehensive nonpartisan modeling of the economic impact of the unification of the Northern Ireland and Republic of Ireland economies. This has been obviously a difficult week with the events in Paris, so I particularly want to thank everyone for coming out today to learn more about these issues and the report. I want to particularly welcome our dignitaries in attendance from the Government of Ireland and others who are here, including media who are in attendance. Again, it's been a difficult week for international affairs, so I appreciate everyone coming out this evening. I'd also like to point out that we invited the British consulate to join us here this evening. They had other obligations, as well as other representatives of the British government, as well as, and the political parties, all the political parties in both the North and the Republic of Ireland. Finally, we also invited others to the event, including representatives from places like Turkey and Greece, who have their own issues involving Cyprus, and from the Koreas, since there have been similar simulations modeling the economic impacts of unification in those areas. And I just want to point out again that, as you'll see, this is an independent, nonpartisan, objective economic study conducted by, if I may, some of the most esteemed researchers in the world on these issues. I want to point out at the outset that there are no political axes to grind here. That said, we'll believe you'll find the results of this study to be both comprehensive and compelling, making a very strong, independent case for the economic benefits of unification. And getting the facts right is important. As one of my former employers, Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, once said, everyone is entitled to their own opinions, but not their own facts. And so while there may be differences of opinion on the political dimensions of these issues, we believe this report shows definitively the facts, that there would be a significant and long-term economic benefit from the unification of the Irish economies, particularly in the North, but in the Republic as well. And there's no better time for this sort of study, which, by the way, had been in the works for more than 2 years. But the timing's fortuitous. Issues such as the state of Northern Ireland and its economy and the continued involvement of the United Kingdom in the European Union are all front burner and have been in the news in both Ireland and across Europe. In fact, a BBC RTE primetime special early in November looked specifically at the unification issue. A poll conducted in conjunction with that special showed that Irish opinion on the unification of the two separate governments varied widely depending upon if you were in the North or the South. About 2/3 in the Republic were for the unification of the two governments and the two economies, but only about 1/3 in Northern Ireland felt that way. And what is significant about that is that this economic modeling shows that those who would most benefit from economic unification are those who live in Northern Ireland, where the economy is, I wouldn't say in free fall, but is so disparate compared to the economy of the Republic. And for everyone in both the Republic and the North, this study points out that unification does not mean cuts in services or increase in taxes. And in fact, the benefits flow to the Republic just as much as they do to the North. And that's why facts are so important. And getting facts like these in front of the right audiences can really help them make the right decisions about the best way forward. And so let me introduce our presenters. First, we will hear from Dr. Kurt Eubner, the lead author of the study. Dr. Eubner is a professor of political science at the University of British Columbia, where he holds the Jean Monnet Chair for European Integration and Global Political Economy. He also acts as the director of the university's Institute for European Studies. Dr. Eubner is the author of 12 books and numerous articles, and he has expertise in European integration in the context of the global political economy. Dr. Eubner and the consulting firm he's affiliated with, KLC, provided the overall leadership for this project. Dr. Renger van Nukhoff, close enough, is the director and founder of ModelWorks in Switzerland, who is in charge of the modeling exercise. He is also a lecturer and researcher at ETH, the Engineering, Technology, Mathematics, and Management University in the city of Zurich, Switzerland. He's also a lecturer at ECOMOD, which is an advanced applied computational equilibrium modeling entity, and has presented in Brussels, Washington, Bangkok, and Prague. And finally, to provide a global economic perspective on the potential for unification, we have Michael Burke, a slightly easier name to pronounce. Michael is an economic consultant and the former senior international economist at Citibank in London. Time permitting, at the end of our presentations, we will take questions from the audience, and I invite you to, after the event, stay for a little bit more of the reception, and I thank you all for coming. So we'll begin with Dr. Yu.
Thank you very much for the nice introduction. You already made a summary, so I'm wondering what's my job now to do. Let me start with, my job today is walking you through the report only, and not in a bit more detail than what's just being done. But let me start with a more personal note at the very beginning. You may wonder why a German political economist teaching and researching in Vancouver is doing a study on Irish Unification and presenting it in New York. I mean, this is quite a kind of collection of incidents, but there are good reasons for that. And one reason has to do, probably have to confess, maybe I have an obsession with black swans. This goes back to, not too long ago actually, November 1989. Sitting in my apartment in Berlin, West, and all of a sudden loud noises outside, strange noises. And then I looked out a window, and there were all those little cars. I only was aware that they drive usually in the eastern part of the city, and they were all around the Kurfürstendamm. That's the area I lived. And then I realized, obviously, something big happened. And then I went to the TV, and there it was, the fall of the wall. And then only briefly later, a couple of months later, German unification started. At the time, I was working at a free university in Berlin, the political science department, at the time the largest political science department in Western Europe. And we had a lot of colleagues specialized on so-called GDR research. And none of them anticipated, never everybody mentioned about parties, all those kind of things. There was never a talk of the day that there would be something like German unification could happen. And all those experts were very detailed. They had a lot of knowledge on GDR, personalities, who would follow what. They knew everything, but the big picture was not there. So it was one of those events that happened that changed the world to some degree, but also changed my life in a sense that I was aware, and in a kind of hard way also, I learned, like many others, there comes German unification and nobody is really prepared. We don't know anything. We didn't know the kind of data about the GDR economy. So it was a kind of blind flight that was started on all sides. Nobody knew exactly, the direction was clear, but what would be the inputs and the outcomes? Nothing was clear. And this was a kind of lesson to be learned, that there may be events happening. We may anticipate, we may know it may happen. We don't know whether it happens in our lifetime. We don't know exactly the circumstances, but they may happen. And thinking about those kind of events seems to be a kind of intellectual, let us say, an attitude, a sentiment that drives curiosity and makes you ask questions. Very often, other people are not asking. So that's the one element. A second observation, also on a kind of personal note, and you may not share this, at least based on my view of the world, I think so, we see an increase in the number of black swans. The financial crisis, 2008, was one of those things. We had all those kind of knowledge about the kind of stability of the financial regime. At the same time, we know all about there are problems, there are loopholes, there are kind of contradictions, but This time it's different. This kind of opinion said, we were thinking things will continue forever probably, and then the crisis hit. And again, nobody was really prepared, and we all, the global economy until today, is to some degree suffering from the aftermath implications of this big event. There may be others, but still what I want to say is, even though I have no idea whether Irish unification will happen at all, whether it will happen as long as I live, I don't have any kind of stock into this whole debate, but at least, it's one of those things that may happen, one of those black swans that may occur. Out of sudden it's there, we don't know, but because it's very much driven by political decisions, by sentiments. You refer to the kind of the polls that are going on. There may be one little trigger and things can change very easily. This can be direct or indirect trigger. So this is the kind of curiosity-driven research I like to do. And when there was an opportunity, there's curiosity that makes you think about some problems, but then you need an opportunity to really follow through with those kind of curiosity-driven research. And when I was approached whether I would be interested to do or to guide a study that would deal with Irish unification, I said, that's a great idea. That's something really, and very interesting topic, but it must be clear, whoever, it's an academic project. It's a project where we need to lay out in a very clear way. There should be no interferences, even though I was never, even until today, I'm not an Ireland specialist in any case, but I'm still aware that it's a highly debated topic, so to say. It's a kind of hot potato topic, and I wanted to make sure from the very beginning, if I start a project like this, it must be clear, no interferences from outside. It must be an academically defined project and a study, and exactly this was what we were able to do. It was fixed in a kind of contract, and this was the start of our project. So that's the kind of the beginning. You mentioned we have no stake. It's really a kind of objective way, but still it's a kind of technical process we started about 2 years ago. Actually, it was planned to like 9 months or so. This was a kind of calculation, maybe 12 months. Being aware there may be problems, but then it turned out it's a pretty complicated process on many, many levels. And this has, I put it here in my cough kind of start, feasibility. This was obviously a big issue, even though now we have clarified all the kind of parameters, is it possible to do a modeling exercise like the one we planned? Is it feasible? Because we may have been naive to some degree, but we were not so naive, not being aware that there was no other study out there. Usually a lot of areas you're dealing with, there are studies out there, you can refer to literature, all those kind of things, and you look at it and you can say, okay, they did it this way, but we can improve, we change a little things, and then we come to other conclusions and so on. In this regard, a study like this was not existing. Again, it was pretty clear there must be reasons for that, why this never has been started in any kind of successful way. And a lot has to do, obviously, with the problem that the data, all those kind of modeling exercises need independent at the beginning, which kind of model you are referring to. They are data hungry. Those are modeling needs a lot of input. Without this, it's not working at all. And it was clear the social accounting matrix for Northern Ireland is not available. It's not disaggregated on this level, and it's not being collected, or if it would be collected, I don't know. It's not being published in a way, but on the side of the UK, that you can make use of it. So the question was, is there a way to create something like a proxy sum, a proxy social accounting matrix, all this kind of data that would help us to solve the problem? And this is exactly the kind of exercise we started with, and I would say so about half of the time of the thousands of hours that went into this project were dedicated to dealing with the data side. And our data guy, the data researcher, Yuri Trices, one of the members of the project team, he really dedicated a lot of time and fantasy and a lot of, let us say, connections, communications with all those kind of people dealing with the data for Northern Ireland in particular, in order to come up with a proxy procedure that would allow us to have the input data necessary for the modeling. So, in absence of those input-output tables, internal and external transfer data, regionalized data, and all this kind of disaggregation, all this many, many data you would need, and you will see later on when Ranger, our model builder, will provide you with a kind of graphic illustration of the model, of the structure of the model, what kind of data inputs you need. In order to deal with those problems, we actually came up with a variety of methodologies that we didn't invent, we could make use out of it. And you can see here, we will see all these kind of things are reported in the project report, step by step. You don't have to go through, it's very kind of technical. But it was pretty clear in a very conservative way. We used estimations, but also kind of methodologies that would allow us to become pretty close to data that would reflect the kind of, if there would be an official social accounting matrix being published for Northern Ireland, our data would be pretty close to what official sources would probably publish. And we were a bit lucky in the sense that one of the contacts we made over the course of the project was actually, her name is Anna Corinna Miller, Trinity College, Dublin. It turned out this young lady is just finishing her PhD in economics, doing a social accounting matrix for Northern Ireland. Well, this is seen generally as a large problem, that those data are not available. So there are people out there, serious people, who are dealing with this little things like accounting. It's very boring. I find it the most boring thing. On the other side, it's very exciting, because when you're getting those data out, when all this kind of the stuff at the end looks extremely promising, and you learn a lot from those data. So we could communicate a lot with her. A lot of Skype time went off, but she was helpful also. And at the end of the day, we could create this proxy social accounting matrix for Northern Ireland. And that's also something I don't want to say the first thing, because as I mentioned, there's this lady in Dublin who is doing the same kind of thing. But at least we could produce and generate data that allowed us to feed a model. Now, you will hear much more about the modeling. I will be very brief about this. But obviously, it's pretty clear all those models, if you do a simulation, they need, as I mentioned, those data input. And so first of all, we were looking at one model, the so-called Hermes model, mainly developed by John Bradley, a pretty, a scholar in Ireland, great reputation, doing a lot on both sides, border economies stuff and all those kind of things. Very great reputation. Had long talks with him. And he was always making the case we should go towards his model, so to say. And then we went into the details and figured out that at least the thing we want to accomplish, the way we are thinking about Irish unification, the way we thought it should be modeled in a proper way, in a kind of dynamic way rather than in a static way and all those kind of things, it was pretty clear with this model we couldn't do it. So then we were going back this step. You have to think about it in a way it's like in a trial and error thing. You go for something, you invest a lot of time, you try to figure out whether this would work, you try it really, and then you come to the conclusion it's not working in the way that we could really produce what we're supposed to produce, and then you go another route. Next step, so to say. You see this as a kind of failure, but it's a positive failure in the sense that you can conclude this way isn't working. So we turned our attention to another approach, and this is the so-called KIM model. This, as has been mentioned, developed by Mark Noland, who was writing a kind of executive evaluation of the report in an independent way. It's also part of our report, you can see, and John Robinson. And they came up with a model applied to the case of Korea. This all happened after German unification, when this interest was. We should think about those kind of problems. Black swans. There may be never Korean unification, but we should think about it. What would happen? What would be the effect? So they did this, and did it in a way exactly accepting and dealing with the challenge, the same kind of challenge we had for our project, that for one part, in this case, North Korea, there were no data available. So I don't want to say Northern Ireland is like North Korea. There are huge differences, obviously. But in terms of data, we were running into the same kind of thing. So that was a fact. And but this model, the KIM model, allowed us, so to say, to think about in creative ways how to deal with a situation where even with the proxy SAM, we would be able to feed a model and to go forward. So the modeling approach, this way, no, here. It's a multi-sector, multi-region, dynamically recursive, computable general equilibrium model. You know, this sounds fantastic. It's great, and you will hear all about this from Ranger in a kind of in a nice way. I looked at a slide. Even I could understand it probably the first time. Actually, even after all those many hours and so on we invested. Main thing, it has been calibrated at the base kind of year is 2009. This has to do with the availability of data. Now we have U data. We could run the whole thing. Again, a couple of thousand hours maybe not as many, but now we know better how it works. But we could use now U data, but this has just been published. And we would still have to do the other stuff for Northern Ireland. So it's calibrated 2009. We made a lot of kind of little tests because 2009, you're aware, 2007, 2008, financial crisis, 2009, everything went down. But so far, in a kind of general way, one can argue, and this is still valid in empirical terms, the 2009 data, to some degree, are the new normal. You may have heard about this whole kind of debate of secular stagnation. You know, things are no longer as good in terms of economic growth on a global level, and the same holds there. So our calibration actually turned out not to be a bad choice. The period we are running the model, you know, you have to make a decision for which year should we start with those kind of simulation modeling. The period is 2018 to 2025. So not too long. 2.5 years from now, we should start to say, and then you would see the effects. So what are the key variables or the key drivers of our simulation? So there are 5 components, more or less. So we started out to say, okay, let's assume a unified tax system in the sense that Northern Ireland adopts the tax regime of the Republic of Ireland. Number 2, now with a unification, you have a common market in the true sense, not only the current kind of border economy, but a truly common market in the sense. The trading costs, how they are called, transaction costs, trading costs, are getting smaller. So we assumed, again, in a conservative way, an annual reduction of 5%. Obviously, if you start to think about unification, this would mean Northern Ireland would join, or both would come together, Republic and Northern Ireland, but this means you have to make a choice about the currency regime. Obviously, it only would make sense to say, okay, the euro will be introduced as a new currency in the northern part of the United Ireland. At a time, 2009, but also today, this means obviously a strong devaluation effect, given the kind of the exchange rate of the euro at the time. So there's the exchange rate effect. Number 4, political union, we modeled, you know, again, it's political union in a very economic, strict, narrow sense. We don't care about all this other stuff, but it's ideological politics, all those kind of things. Everything is out of the model. We only see, okay, if there is now one government, political union, this means there are a lot of functions that are double in both parts. You know, they can be reduced. And again, we assume in a very conservative way a 2% reduction in government expenditures for Northern Ireland, in the sense that we get rid of all those kind of duplicative functions of the government. And then, number 5, fiscal transfer. This is obviously something we have to deal with. And we assume for the modeling Northern Ireland budget deficits financed by the Republic of Ireland transfers. So that's the whole idea. Those are the 5 drivers. And what we did then in the report, again, step by step, in order to help everybody to go through the process, we looked at each of those drivers in a separate way. Like we didn't combine them. Like you separate everything, and then we went through the various analyses. And next step was then, based on this, to go to scenarios. And we overall have 3 scenarios. Scenario number 1. This is the most conservative scenario, with very strong, let's say, strong conservative assumptions. So again, it starts out, United Ireland finances entire NI budget, Northern Ireland budget deficit. The harmonization of government functions reduces Northern Ireland expenditures by 2% annually, all the kind of stuff I just mentioned. And then, rather than assuming anything positive from the fact that we introduce changes in the tax regime and so on, we think no effect at all. So based on this very conservative modeling, what comes to the forefront is, so the GDP growth effects for Northern Ireland are positive. The GDP growth effects for the Republic of Ireland are positive, but smaller than the ones for Northern Ireland. In terms of euro amounts, over the period of 2018 to 2025, the gains in GDP for Northern Ireland accumulate to 8.8 billion euros. The effects for GDP effects for the Republic of Ireland accumulates to 1.8 billion euros. And what you can see here is those are the growth rates in GDP per capita for those two regions. Look at the top ones. And what you can see here is, so this conservative modeling, even though the effects are positive for both, and then the effects for Northern Ireland are larger, it's petering out. The growth rates are, the positive growth rates, additional kind of effects due to unification are getting smaller and smaller. So something you would expect. So it's a kind of, not a kind of one time because it's 8 years, but still it's a kind of, it's over this period and then it looks like it's done. Therefore, let's go to scenario number 2. The same kind of starting assumptions like in the first scenario, but then we would no longer assume in a silly kind of strange way like we did in the first scenario, but only to make the case. We no longer assume that the adoption of the tax regime, the kind of homogenized tax regime for United Ireland, that this does no longer have any kind of effect. And as a matter of fact, what we can see here is, in this scenario where we look more on this FDI, foreign direct investment effect, and the effects on productivity, it turns out that the changes for GDP growth rates for Northern Ireland on average over the period are 4.1%, and still for the Republic of Ireland, it's still 1.2%. So there are very strong productivity effects for Northern Ireland due to the harmonization of the tax and FDI regimes in this kind of modeling. So the GDP effects for Northern Ireland accumulate to 11.3 billion euros over the simulation. And in this particular scenario too, the effect for Republic of Ireland even is in absolute terms larger, but then we have to look at relative terms. It's a larger economy with a larger, let us say, regional GDP. So in relative terms, it's smaller. In relative terms, it's pretty strong for Northern Ireland in this scenario. Scenario 3, that's so to say, tries to put together all those assumptions in a way with one slight twist, so to say. We now assume that a 2% savings in government expenditures I talked about due to the abolition of those duplicative functions, they are no longer used towards the deficit reductions for the budget, but they are now spent in a kind of productive way. And if we assume there's the 2% is additional government spending for productive purposes, then the picture even is getting much, much stronger. Let me first go here. Then we can see the percent changes for GDP per capita for Northern Ireland are on average over the period 7.6%, pretty high, but they stay very high. Actually, they're even increasing. For the Republic of Ireland, they're relatively small, but still they're positive. So that's so to say the kind of the big message. And if you go back, then you can see the GDP effects for Northern Ireland accumulate to about 25 billion euros over the simulation period, and the GDP effects for the Republic of Ireland accumulate to roughly 10 billion euros over the simulation period. So it's very, very strong in this regard. Now, what are I should make a comment on one kind of other comment from Mark Noland, the person who did this kind of independent evaluation of our study. We sent it to him, and he looked at it, went through it, when he's the expert in this kind of thing, one of the few like Ranger, and he looked at it, and he came back very positive, but he made this one comment, something I need to comment because it's in his review is in the report, he was saying, you know, you actually underestimated the positive effects. They could be even higher if you would not only model, like we did, the kind of the 2% thing again. We modeled it as a reduction in government expenditures. But we didn't model at the same time that if the government is saving 2% on an annual base, that they would also get rid of people. You know? And the idea from Noland is now the way he would suggesting a kind of additional modeling would be if the government, by spending a 2% savings in a productive way, make sure that those people working in those areas, getting retrained and all those kind of things, would get productive jobs, then actually this would be an additional push for GDP for the overall United Ireland. So, you know, only to give you one example, in the report you would find other examples where we try to justify why we did actually very conservative, careful estimations and assumptions rather than going for the maximum, because we wanted to make sure we don't want to exaggerate, you know, with all those kind of things. And this is the one most prominent example mentioned here by Noland. Now let me make some conclusions. But number one, this first modeling exercise shows, and really in a kind of technical way, independent from any wishful thinking, that unification is a net gain for a united Ireland. Obviously, in relative terms, and depending on the scenario, sometimes also in absolute terms, the gains for Northern Ireland would be stronger than the ones for the Republic of Ireland, even though in both cases positive. Now, this is, so to say, to some degree no surprise. One would expect, but the expectation was fulfilled, a region, Northern Ireland in this case, that is relatively less developed, relatively less modernized in many respects, like the other region. There is more catch-up space, how it's economists are labeling this. So there's more possibilities to overcome problems in inefficiencies and all those kind of things. So exactly, this expectation is exactly being confirmed. Now, I want to make sure when we did this component analysis, it was pretty clear the exchange rate effect can be pretty strong. But then we decided not to bring the exchange rate into this whole kind of scenarios due to the fact that that is a kind of, not a kind of one time, but it will peter out over time. You know, it's not a kind of sustainable driver of economic growth. You can't rely, you should not rely for a longer term period on a steady depreciation of your currency. You know, this is doesn't make too much sense. It can help for the moment, and this is exactly why depreciations are happening and are an economic policy tool, but nothing that is sustainable. Therefore, we put it out, but I only want to mention it. But the real driver of catch-up and unification gains has a lot to do with the FDI regime and the tax regime, because they are drivers for productivity effects. And it's all about, at the end of the day, the productivity effects that count. And the study shows pretty clear that in order to make this to a sustainable driver, you know, the way we modeled it, you harmonize those kind of FDI and tax regimes, and then the various interconnections are working, and there is more inflow of FDI. And due to the fact that you can expect there are more multinational companies locating their activities in a United Ireland, and given the empirical fact that those companies are coming with a relatively higher productivity because they have other management organizations, all those kind of things. So this all drives those productivity effects. But in order to make them sustainable, it's only conclusion, it's not a part of the modeling. It's pretty clear a government of a united Ireland definitely must be willing and able to follow a kind of active state policies, an active industrial policy, active educational in order to keep up the skills, in order to provide the next generation of those kind of workers, because international companies, they may come, some of them, for tax reasons. They're also coming for other reasons. Those are the kind of soft factors that needs to get supported. And so there's a kind of policy element in it. Again, something we didn't model. But exactly, this would be exactly the way Mark Noland was suggesting to us. If we think about a sensible and smart use of the savings due to the abolition of duplicative government function, this would be the way to go, and this would allow to make FDI and the tax regime to a much more sustainable driver for its whole effects on Irish unification. Now, that's the study. You will hear more from Ranger, but I also should say, don't take all those data very literally. Whether it's 10 billion, for example, accumulated over time, or it's 8 billion, this should not be the issue. The issue is, and this is pretty good confirmed, at least the way I'm reading our outcomes, our simulation results show the direction, and the directions are positive effects for both regions and for overall Irish unification. And this already is itself a very strong message, I think, so given at least my understanding of the literature, my understanding of the debates, that unification may be in economic terms a not so good idea. This study shows, based on the way we modeled it in this conservative way, that Irish unification actually shows positive gains, net gains for the overall both regions, even with varying results. So far the study, and now you will get a bit more insight. How is this magic outcome getting produced? How reliable are those kind of models and stuff we did? Thanks for your attention.
Before I start, I don't say this model is the best model ever. I'm not alone in that. If we go back to George Box, who was a professor at Wisconsin, he said, remember that all models are wrong. It's just a question, how wrong can they be to still be useful? We will see this model has lots of assumptions, but it is also a very good tool, and I will show you why. Now, this computable general equilibrium modeling, like we use, we just name it CGE because it's such a mouthful, is one of the main workhorses in quantitative economics. There are, I think, 10,000 of studies done with these kinds of models. And it's been done since 30 years. I've been doing this stuff like 25 years for the Swiss government. And it's the workhorse. So, but that's still no reason to use it. The main reason is, in fact, that it's a consistent framework. It's based on microeconomic theory. It means consistent. We will come back to that. It's a nice way of combining theory and data. And in that sense, it has a big advantage over other models like Keynesian models, where lots of assumptions and ad hoc assumptions go in. We stay within the microeconomic foundation. And we will see that in a general equilibrium model, we have, in fact, all the agents in a country. We have the producers, we have the firms, we have the households, we have the government, we have the rest of the world, and they all interact, and that's the general equilibrium part of it. They interact with each other, and if somebody changes something, like the government introduces a policy, this ripples through the whole economy and has its impacts on all the economic agents. Another nice part of this kind of models, it gives us sometimes insights we didn't expect. As an economist, I know if I put in a tax policy, I should know what will come out. But sometimes you get the result and you say, what's happening here? A small example, I worked for the Swiss government and we had the task to look at a CO2 tax to reduce energy demand. They said the idea is that we use the revenue to reduce wage costs. And they would write in the law 1% of wage cost. And then I had to implement it, and then I said, hey, this is not going to work, because if you have a CO2 tax, energy is going like this, GDP is going like this, wages go up like this. You don't have enough revenue to pay every year this 1%. And then they had to think about other ways of financing this gap that will finally appear. And there was one result. Perhaps if you're very smart, you could have found it in advance. But so another nice feature is it's a mathematical model, and mostly you can't find a very neat analytical solution, and therefore we use models. Now, for what kind of work is a CGE model can be used? it can be used, in fact, for every big fiscal policy, every big trade policy, social policy. I was the bad guy who did a study in Switzerland on how to finance the pension for the people, and told the minister that a good idea would be to raise the age to 67. He brought it to the journalist, and since then nobody's talking about it anymore. So you can use it for lots of stuff, like this unification. Another nice thing is, if you use a model like that, you get information on a multitude of effects, like all the macroeconomic variables you have, the GDP, the trade flows, the international trade, terms of trade, prices, you name it, you get information on that. So you can do a very thorough analysis. Now, something very important is that this is not an econometric model. In an econometric model, you are able to estimate, hopefully, the way the GDP will develop in the next few years. The projections usually made. This is not a model that tells you GDP will be 400 billion in the next year. What we do is we assume that the economy will continue like it is at the moment, and that's our business as usual, no policy changes, and then we change something in the economy and we compare those results. And then we do these simulations and we start talking about what would be a good policy relative to the benchmark scenario where we don't do anything. So it's a simulation tool. It's not a tool where these figures, as Kurt already said, have to be taken like, well, this will be our GDP in the next year. And as Kurt already showed you, we compare the different scenarios and say, look, this will bring us more than if we do what we did until now. Now, a little bit about the building blocks. I won't give a lecture on how this mathematically goes, but I already told we have all the firms, we have 54 sectors. That's not that much, but it gives you an idea on what agriculture does, what services does. And in the model, these firms, they maximize their profits or they minimize their cost. We have households who are eager to maximize their welfare, which means consumption or leisure. And then we have markets where those two meet, and as a part of the interaction, you get the prices and the quantities demanded. Then we have the government who collects revenues and pays transfers, has a deficit usually. And then the difference with the Korean model was that we took, first of all, we took the two regions completely separately. So we had the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, but then that's not the whole world. So we needed the rest of the world, and you could, in fact, model these as also complete economies in a model like this, but we closed the model easily by sending exports out, getting imports in, and the transfers, and then you get a closure rule, as it's called, to tell something about the effects with trades with those regions. Now, this is a little bit a figure how it looks like. You see, it's not that important how the structure exactly is. We have everything in here, households, government, the rest of the world. We have the several markets. What important is here is the arrows. You see that, in fact, everything is connected. So if you change something like we changed, for example, the taxes. And for example, the taxes on here, we changed them here in the Northern Ireland. This will have an impact on the government, revenues will change, it will have impact on the prices, the demand will change, it will have an impact on the capital markets, on the households, and of course, on imports and exports. And this whole interaction is one of the great features of CGE modeling. Now, the Neroy model, as we called it, as already said, it's a multi-regional model, Bayesian 2009, and explicit treatment of time. Now, as I show you here, here are those 5 drivers to adjust tax structure, factor taxes, output taxes, income taxes, and the tariffs are adjusted. Or, for example, the changes in productivity is here in the producer side, Then changes in transportation costs will have its impact on the imports and the exports, and then again will ripple through the whole economy. Then the reduction of the administration cost will have its impact also on the whole economy. And then at last, the devaluation, where we saw that it had a huge impact. Now, this is in a nutshell, in fact, the CGE model as it's been used. But once again, I will finish with some data issues, although I think I will skip it, but it's not that much interest. These are the 54 sectors. I think the most important thing is, as Tyle, a Dutch economist, said once, models are to be used and not to be believed. So I thank you very much. Michael.
It'll make a noise.
Okay. Oh, yeah.
Thank you all for your patience. I was asked to come along this evening because I've had no hand in this report that Kurt has led on, but I've come to very similar conclusions by a very different route. And I very much welcome Kurt's report. One, because I very much agree with those conclusions, and two, in any event, I think that this area is a very neglected area of the policy debate as it takes place, insofar as it takes place with regard to the benefits or otherwise of Irish reunification. Because you would think that an obvious aspect of that debate would be whether people are going to be better off or not. But actually, the economic case is the one that's least seldom discussed. So I think this report is extremely valuable in that regard. And I think that the conclusions are very interesting. I came at this topic, as I said, from a slightly different route. And the pieces that I've done over time have been collected as here, and some of you may have a copy of this. Unfortunately, I don't think I've brought enough. The fundamental starting point, I think, from my perspective, is explicit, and I think it's implicit in Kurt's paper. The most fundamental aspects of economics were first identified by Adam Smith, who unfortunately has since lapsed into some comic book character who only ever talked about the invisible hand of the market. In fact, he wrote one of the great founding documents of any science, which is The Wealth of Nations. And what he describes in it is a process that he calls the division of labor and how that leads to prosperity. And sometimes people get very hung up about what precisely that means and the implications of that. The most important way, one of the easiest ways of illustrating it is I can be fairly certain that not a single person in this room got to this room by a mode of transport that they themselves made. In fact, the mode of transport, even if you walked, you were still using shoes. And I doubt you made those. And any product that was used for that mode of transportation had many, many hands involved in its production. And the reason we've evolved to a society and an economy like that is because it's more efficient. It's far less efficient if you were to try to make even your own shoes, and good luck with making your own motor car. That's the first point. Now, Adam Smith identified that the scope for the operation of the division of labor to work was limited in the first instance by the size of the home market. And the difficulty for Ireland is it's never had a home market, ever, in its history. Ireland was a colony of Britain long before capitalism and didn't develop a home market on that basis. As capitalism developed, particularly after the Industrial Revolution in Britain, Ireland was still, the entirety of Ireland was part of an empire. It was a colony. And it's only since the ending of partition, the ending of the British domination of the southern part of Ireland with partition, and then after very many decades of a foolish economic policy of autarky, which precisely breaks Adam Smith's rules, that policies were adopted that opened up the southern part of Ireland to international trade and international investment flows. And what you've seen over that period, say for example, if you take the period from 1992 to 2000, the Irish economy doubled in real terms, was the extraordinary growth of the economy. And that hasn't happened in the case of the Northern Ireland economy. And there's a very specific reason for that. And I could go into great detail, but I won't try your patience. But essentially, what the Southern Irish economy has been able to do is more thoroughly integrate itself into world markets. That's the basis of its prosperity. It's not a magic formula. It's not because people one side of the border are more hardworking or brighter or whatever. It's because they, the operation of the laws relating to the international division of labour have been allowed to work in the Southern Irish economy. Now, the difficulty for Northern Ireland is twofold. One, it has a history of being integrated as part of the British Empire economy, which really saw its boom years as the empire was rising, and then in the two world wars, because it was a very significant industrial and military base for Britain and what became the United Kingdom. But those days are gone, they're long gone, and they're not going to come back. And actually what's happened since is the Northern Ireland economy has remained tied to a really slow-moving British economy. I mean, people in Britain are, or should be, amongst economists, it's a familiar tale, may be less so elsewhere. The general population, I think, is unaware of it. Is quite how spectacular the relative decline of the British economy has been over decades and more than a century. About 140, 150 years ago, Britain accounted for just under 10% of world output. It now accounts for less than 2.5% of world output, and there is no reason whatsoever to believe that that trend is going to change in the foreseeable future. The fundamental reason for that to do with the structures of the British economy, but I won't detain you on that. But in effect, the Northern Ireland economy is a semi-detached carriage of a slow-moving train, and it can't possibly grow in a significant basis while it's attached to Britain, because Britain has a very slow-moving economy, and that isn't going to alter. That is going to be the pattern for as far as the eye can see. Now, there's a whole series of benefits that flow from creating an Irish home market for all producers, be they in the private sector or the public sector, because you've increased the size of the home market. In the case of Northern Ireland, you'd be quadrupling the size of the home market, and in the case of the Republic, you'd be increasing it by about 25, 30%. But of course, the position then is even magnified beyond that, because the Southern Irish economy is integrated into the European economy in a way that Britain isn't. And despite all the problems of the European economy, it's a much, much larger market than Britain. And so there are significant benefits that flow from that. And I think, just moving towards the summation, is I think that the model that has been developed by Kurt and his team goes into some of the nuts and bolts of how that process would work. But that is the fundamental basis of the process, i.e. that a unified Irish economy is a growth story. That's my main message. Thanks very much.
So we're at the end of our program. I know that it's getting late, but if anyone has any questions, I want to remind you there's copies of the report in back, and the reception will continue for a few minutes longer if you want to ask any of the speakers questions individually. So any questions anyone has? Yes, go ahead.
In simple terms, this is directed to Kurt. Is it correct to say that your study found that if Ireland was united, the average person in Ireland, in a solely economic sense, would be better off than they are in a divided Ireland?
Yes. 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 I mean, that's the message. I mean, having said that, you saw this GDP per capita, but again, that's an average. And obviously, it can be that some of those growth gains will end up in particular corners of the economy. This is then a question of fairness, distribution policies, all the regular kind of things we find in all economies, whether it's united or not. So that's, again, the study models effects on GDP per capita, productivity effects. How they come down to an individual household is then a next policy step. When we didn't touch upon policies, this was not our task, and this is also something, then there's a lot of debate. Should you go, in order to create fairness, equal distribution of those gains, should you do X, Y, Z? I would have kind of ideas how to do it, but this may not be ideas you would like or anybody else would like. Then we would really distract our whole kind of debate or our results coming down to this policy issues. We didn't do that. But the space, the space is available exactly to that each household, each individual, generally spoken, would have the chance to benefit positively from Irish unification. That's exactly the result.
Any other questions?
I noticed you very appropriately wanted to remain conservative in your assumptions in building the study, but in that you assumed a 2% saving in integrating the Northern Ireland economy into the South. Given that the percentage of public employment in the North grew to such a high level, I think it was 70% or thereabout, artificially propped up during the years of conflict for political reasons, you need to rationalize that. And I would have thought that the savings would have been greater in that rationalization process than 2%. Perhaps you could just give me the benefit of your thoughts on that.
You make an interesting point, no doubt about it. But we should, first of all, take into consideration it's 2% annually. So that's already gives you 2% annually on government expenditure savings. It ends up with quite a lot of savings overall. So we don't underestimate it. But then again, if you would, and we talked about it, discussed it in the project, if we could have assumed a higher annual savings rate, so to say, then you would run into the problem that this may be seen as a kind of let's say harsh austerity kind of thing. What we are looking for again in a conservative way was a kind of a steady reduction over the whole simulation period, and 2% is end up with quite a lot. You would still have, let us say, too many people in the public service ending up in Northern Ireland. This may be the case. But again, this is a kind of policy issue. But it's one of those elements where you could say, we should have gone for 3%. Then the effect overall, in how the way we modeled it, would have been higher. Particularly if we would assume, like Noland was suggesting, not only the savings, if we would have taken this approach saying, okay, 3% savings would, let us say, respectively lead to a 3% reduction of people working in the public sector, rather than sending them into unemployment, but would not be very productive. This would then be the task of this active industrial policy I was mentioned, skills training, all those kind of things that are in place in many countries in order to make sure that those people who are getting laid off from those particular public sectors are getting new jobs in areas with a relatively high productivity. And if you take this into consideration, then the overall GDP effect would actually be higher. But we made this restriction, be conservative. We only assumed the 2% in order to avoid any kind of critique saying this may be a too high kind of number. So your point is taken, but I see it as more a confirmation of our more conservative approach we have chosen.
Great. Other questions?
Thank you. I found it all fascinating. I will confine myself just to one question. If the Eurozone area continues to be stagnant with low growth, and if the United Kingdom, by contrast, benefits from its flexible exchange rate, what are the consequences for your modeling? Did you build that in? Because it seems to me highly sensitive, your modeling assumptions, to the benefits Ireland will gain from the North joining the euro. That would not be my only critical question, but it's the one I'll confine myself to.
Should I? You? Okay, I go for it. It's always helpful if there's a model builder who, at the end of the day, he makes all those kind of decisions and builds it into it, but he's not really making the decisions. It's a kind of choice thing. Again, it's one of those things, where you're right to some degree. The Eurozone is part of the rest of the world, all those kind of export-import transactions we put in. If we assume, and there may be good reasons for that, that's being more closer to my own area of expertise rather than modeling, doing European economics. If we would assume that growth in Eurozone would be stagnant for quite a long time, let us say the simulation period, then obviously the trade effects may be not as strong as we assumed. At the same time, and this is something out of kind of uncertainties. I don't want to say black swans, but models can build in those kind of uncertainties, growth rates of the Eurozone for the next 10 years. The same thing is we didn't touch nobody talked so far about, probably you don't believe it that it's happening, Brexit. Imagine there would be something like Brexit would happen. What would this mean for Ireland? There's just been a study being out by colleagues we have been also in contact with. I would totally, you have maybe heard about it, where Brexit would lead, according to their modeling, a different kind of modeling, not as let us say, as far-going as ours, but they did modeling in regards to Brexit and came to the conclusion that this may be negative for Ireland, actually. I would, if we would have dealt with it, I would have made a point that if something like this would happen, this would actually be good for Irish unification, good for Ireland, because if Britain would leave, this would attract probably a lot of more multinational companies who still prefer being part of the European Union, but operating in an economic area where English is being spoken, where they can make use of all those developed infrastructure, all those kind of things. So again, something we didn't build in, because this is something where we would have made assumptions from the rest of the world, growth rates, and this we didn't do in this way. So there's this kind of uncertainty. I would be optimistic actually in regards to the Eurozone. Not there is a huge kind of revival, but as I mentioned, the new normalcy will be that the rest of the world also is not growing very much. And we may see a kind of, 1-2% growth as a kind of the new normal. And this has implications not only for Irish unification, but overall for all economies. So it wouldn't, in relative terms, not change a lot. This would be my way to look at it.
Great. Anyone else? No, please.
Did your study take into account at all the effect of political immigration from Ireland and the drain that may have caused on the economy? For example, if you look in today's Cranes, the most recent Cranes article, or magazine, I'm sorry, is out today, and you look at the top 150 companies here in New York City, a couple of those are people who came from the North because of political persecution. Their companies are in the top 10.
Yeah, quick answer, no, we didn't. That's one of the things, where you can't, as Renger mentioned, there's a lot of things you can put in models, and there's a lot of things you shouldn't put into models, because you make things, first of all, more speculative, and we really wanted to avoid any kind of speculation. Therefore, we always went to the more conservative kind of assumptions rather than going to the far-reaching ones. And that's an interesting topic, no doubt about it, but something we didn't build in, and I think so it's a good decision that we didn't do it. My private view on this would be, if Michael Berg and our results are correct, and a unified Ireland would be a growth story, that's what the model is showing, and if there would be smart adjusting state policies, it would be definitely a growth story. This would attract companies, people going back to their home base, so to say, and add additional kind of input that would be another kind of push for economic growth. That would be my way to look at it. I mean, there are a lot of historical examples where you could see the backflow of people and companies if things are going right, and if things are if the economic messages are correct. And again, the model, we shouldn't take the numbers so literally, but the direction is clear. It's a message of a growth story, of a positive growth story. And this may really make people, companies rethink whether this is an attractive place to go. You know, this is a, and the best thing is that the growth story is a sustainable one, at least according to the model. It's not one that has been artificially pushed for quite a few years or so. The main drivers, if you cultivate them, are making this to a sustainable growth story, and that's the promising aspect of the study.
Great, and so I want to thank everyone. The speakers will be here if you have any individual questions, and there's materials in the back, and the reception continues for a little while longer. So thank you very much for coming.